The time period from late 1942 through mid 1943 was very hard on the Allied cruiser force. Battles like Savo Island saw many heavy cruisers lost off of Guadalcanal. There's a reason those waters gained the name Iron Bottom Sound. In today's video, we'll be looking at one of the cruisers lost in 1943, USS Chicago, one of the Northampton-class cruisers. This ship would have an exciting time off of Guadalcanal, seeing combat at Savo Island, where she was heavily damaged. Yet, unlike so many others, Chicago survived that battle. She would not be so lucky in the following Battle of Rennell Island and its aftermath. In this video, we'll cover Chicago's story, from her humble beginnings to the savaging she took in the South Pacific. This is a story that began on the other side of the ocean, on the American West Coast. USS Chicago was laid down on September 11, 1928, by the Mare Island Naval Shipyard. A fairly standard construction period followed, with Chicago launched on April 10, 1930, and commissioned on March 9, 1931. Throughout that entire process, the ship was formally designated CL-29. The Northamptons and their predecessors, the Pensacola's, were considered light cruisers. Prior to 1931, the Navy classified these ships based on their armor, a continuation of the split between protected and armored cruisers, where the armor protection was the major distinction. Well, for the most part. Protected cruisers generally had less firepower, but that wasn't the dividing line. In any case, that system would change with the London Naval Treaty of 1930. At that point, the designation of cruisers shifted. Armor didn't matter. The size of the main battery guns became the dividing line. In this case, 6-inch was the cap on light cruisers. Anything heavier, below battleship scale, became heavy cruisers. That matters for Chicago here because the Northamptons were equipped with 8-inch guns. So the Navy changed her designation from CL for light cruiser to CA-29 for heavy cruiser. Nothing about the ship changed in terms of her design, just the designation, which is as good a point as any to touch on that design. As said, Chicago was a Northampton-class cruiser. Following the redesignation, these were the second class of American heavy cruiser, and set the pattern in a lot of respects for those that followed. The big thing, of course, being the main battery, 3 triple turrets. This consisted of a super-firing pair on the bow, with the third turret on the stern. This came out to 9 8-inch guns in all, and this layout would become the standard for American heavy cruisers, right up to the last of the type, the Des Moines class. To support these weapons, Chicago carried 4 5-inch, 127mm guns. These were dual-purpose weapons carried on the stern deck. Anti-aircraft weaponry past that point was non-existent, aside from assorted machine guns. Later in her service life, Chicago would pick up more anti-aircraft guns, specifically 16 1.1-inch guns in 4 of the infamous quadruple Chicago piano mounts, as well as 28 20mm cannon. The ship also carried 4 scout aircraft with 2 catapults, with the weaponry rounded off as designed by 2 triple torpedo tubes, one set on either side of the ship just behind the aft funnel, for a total of 6 torpedoes in all. Those would be removed relatively quickly, however, as the Navy stopped putting torpedoes on their cruisers, with the exception of the later Atlanta class. Since that wraps up the weaponry, let's now move to the armor. This was on the lighter end, a main belt of around 3.75 inches at its thickest, or 95 millimeters. This was why the ship was originally classified as a light cruiser. Deck armor, meanwhile, came out to 1 to 2 inches, depending on the location. Rounding things off past that point, we have the speed. In this case, 32.5 knots on 107,000 shaft horsepower, through 4 shafts on a displacement of around 9,500 tons. And with that wrapped up, let's move on to service history. As I said earlier, USS Chicago was commissioned on March 9th, 1931. As is typical with ships of that time period, she would have an uneventful peacetime service for about the next decade. The 1930s were a quiet time, with much of the focus on training and fleet exercise. In the United States Navy, that meant the annual fleet problems. Large-scale exercises involving most of the active fleet, which could be exciting, but generally more for the capital ships, especially the aircraft carriers, than for the cruisers. In Chicago's case, she would serve with the scouting force, and remain with that group until 1940 without any stints in the Asiatic fleet. During her time with the scouting force, Chicago would bounce back and forth between the East and the West Coast. She followed the fleet as they moved for the fleet problems. Nothing particularly notable here, aside from one incident in late 1933. In a typically dense Californian fog on October 24th, Chicago collided with a British steamer. This ship, the cargo ship Silver Palm, hit Chicago's port side. At the time, there were 3 ships sailing relatively close together, one being another merchant, the Albion Star. This vessel came out of the fog on Chicago's starboard side, although there was no risk of collision, at least with that ship. Chicago began to steam forward, only for another ship, Silver Palm, to come out of the fog from port. The cruiser did her best to avoid the freighter, but it wouldn't work. The British ship slammed into Chicago just ahead of the number 1 turret. The damage from this was severe, as you can see here. 3 of Chicago's crew were lost, 2 directly, and 1 several hours later at a hospital. Once repairs for the damage concluded, Chicago returned to her peacetime rotation. Training, port visits, all of that fun stuff. Things only materially changed after the 1930s ended and 1940 rolled around, where 2 things of note happened. First, Chicago received one of the early CXAM radar sets, and secondly, she moved bases. On September 29, 1940, Chicago moved to Pearl Harbor. She would remain there for the next year, sailing on various training missions. With one notable exception, in March of 1941, Chicago joined a task group of cruisers and destroyers on a tour of the South Pacific, first arriving in Samoa on March 9th, with the group split into 2 parts after the visit to Samoa. One group visited Tahiti and New Zealand. The other group, Chicago included, sailed on to Australia, including Sydney Harbor, where one of Chicago's more memorable moments would come later on. In any event, after this cruise was over, Chicago returned to Pearl Harbor. She would continue to train out of that port for much of the remaining year. In fact, most of Chicago's time would be spent at sea. This would be the pattern from April 10th through to December of 1941, notably including a certain December morning. On December 7th, 1941, Chicago was at sea with Task Force 12 and USS Lexington. This allowed her to miss the Japanese attack and, as a result, evade any sort of damage. You could consider this lucky in that the cruiser was okay. Because of this, Chicago would spend the rest of December on patrol duty, warily watching for any follow-up attack. None would come, and Chicago was eventually sent away from Hawaii on February 2nd, 1942. She sailed for the South Pacific once more. The cruiser would arrive in Fiji on February 16th, where she joined the Anzac Squadron. If that name sounds familiar, well, that's for good reason. It was a multinational task force named in honor of the Anzacs of Great War fame, featuring American, Australian, and New Zealand cruisers supported by American destroyers. For the next 2 months, Chicago operated on support missions, from covering the landing of troops on New Caledonia to escorting USS Lexington and USS Yorktown. In the latter case, Chicago covered the carriers during their raids on Lae and Salamaua in New Guinea. That took place on March 10th, 1942, and was actually quite successful. Although if you're interested in more detail there, I'll link my videos on Lexington and Yorktown. As for Chicago, she spent much of March and April in or around New Caledonia. She would actually be there at the start of May when American forces began to gather to counter Japanese moves. This was the lead up to the Battle of the Coral Sea, although Chicago would miss the main action there. The cruiser covered Yorktown during the strike on Tulagi before splitting off on a secondary mission. That was on May 7th, where Chicago, joined by the Australian cruisers Hobart and Australia, sailed to counter the Japanese landing forces. Those forces were aimed at Port Moresby, and the cruisers were supposed to stop them. While sailing to do so, Chicago was attacked by Japanese aircraft on May 8, 1942. Fortunately for the Allied cruiser and her companions, the Japanese missed. Even more fortunately, the same applied for a group of Allied bombers that accidentally attacked them later on. However, despite the lack of damage, this detour would ultimately be a waste of time. The Japanese invasion force turned back after the damage their carriers suffered at Coral Sea proper. So Chicago and the other cruisers mostly avoided that battle. Unintentionally, of course, but the point remains. After this, Chicago would return to Sydney, Australia, a port she would be in on the night of May 31st when the Japanese attempted to infiltrate the harbor with midget submarines. A couple would make it inside, with one firing 2 torpedoes at Chicago. Luckily for the cruiser, both missed. One exploded beneath an Australian accommodation ship, sinking her outright. The other ended up running onto rocks. During the attack, Chicago also fired her machine guns on one of the submarines that got too close. That boat was eventually raised with bullet holes in the conning tower, indicating that Chicago's gunners had found their mark. Either way, once that excitement was over, Chicago returned to her old operations, that being patrol duty around Australia and New Caledonia, with this role lasting through June and July of 1942. As a result, the cruiser didn't see any real action for a couple months. That changed in August when the invasion of Guadalcanal kicked off. There would be a couple air attacks against these landings on August 7th and August 8th that Chicago helped fight off. However, her major role would come on August 9th, the Battle of Savo Island. Chicago was part of the Southern Group alongside HMAS Canberra and HMAS Australia. This would be the first group engaged by the Japanese. Canberra was battered into a flaming wreck and eventually scuttled. Chicago, meanwhile, took a torpedo to her bow. This caused severe, but not crippling damage to the cruiser. Another torpedo would hit the ship, although this failed to explode, even if it did leave behind a notable dent. The ship also took a shell to her mainmast, resulting in the loss of 2 crewmen. Chicago pulled away from the battle zone after the Japanese ships moved on. This has become somewhat controversial in later years, as the cruiser made no effort to assist the other Allied ships, and her captain didn't send out a warning either. Regardless, Chicago pulled out and survived the action. She went in for repairs on the West Coast that lasted into January of 1943. Well, technically the repairs concluded in late December 1942, but post-refit trials lasted longer. When that work was done, Chicago was sent back to the combat zone. She arrived back off New Caledonia in late January, where the cruiser returned to escort duty. Her final mission, in fact, came as one of those convoy escorts. On January 27th, the cruiser left New Caledonia, escorting a convoy to Guadalcanal. This group would come under attack 2 days later, on the night of January 29th. This was the Battle of Rennell Island. Chicago, alongside other American ships, came under fierce air attack by G4M Betty bombers. At first, the cruiser was able to evade damage. However, around 7:30, a pair of bombers illuminated Chicago, both with flares and their own burning wreckage. This was enough for other Bettys to land their torpedoes. Chicago took 1 hit by her aft engine room, disabling 3 of her shafts. Another bomber would crash into the radar antenna before spinning into the water. However, another managed to land a second torpedo hit. That flooded the number 3 fire room and the forward engine room. Chicago lost power and drifted as her crew fought the flooding. Eventually, they restored enough power to limp along at 4 knots, and then used a boiler to shift fuel, cutting off a dangerous list. Unfortunately, it wouldn't be enough. Another attack came around 2:45 on January 30th. 4 more torpedoes would hit Chicago, sealing her fate. The cruiser would roll over and sink by her stern. 1,049 of the crew were rescued from the water. By some miracle, considering the damage, only 62 of the crew were lost. And thus ends the story of USS Chicago. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content. And I'll see you in the next one.